Good morning, Manglabar, and on behalf of the donors from the Agriculture and Rural Development Sector Coordination Group, I'd like to warmly welcome you. We have a diverse audience with around 170 people registering. Some people are still getting on right now. This includes members from local policy institutions, bilateral, multilateral donors, members of the INGO Forum, CSOs, UN Socioeconomic Working Group, and private sector partners from UMFCCI and MFVP. Thank you all for taking the time to join us here today. My name is Matt Curtis from USAID's Office of Economic Growth, and I'll be today's moderator. I'd like to make everyone aware that this presentation is being recorded. It will be posted on the IFPRI Myanmar website so that you can review any parts you may have missed or share it with people that couldn't join. USAID, along with FAO, are the donor facilitators for the Agriculture and Rural Development Sector Coordination Group. As can be expected, sector development plans have been upended by the COVID-19 outbreak. This pandemic is having a dramatic but largely unassessed impact on Myanmar's people and economy. The donor group in the agriculture sector are conducting a number of assessments and surveys with the hope of broadly sharing the findings. This webinar is the first such event, and we are grateful to the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, in partnership with Michigan State University, for conducting this important analysis and kindly agreeing to share their findings with us here today. Myanmar's comprehensive economic response plan provides a framework for reducing the impact of COVID-19 and for building a more resilient economy and society. Still, there is a need to provide details on how much should be spent in each area and which groups and people are most affected. We need to know what areas need to be addressed first and what are data-driven approaches to sequence and layer this support. It's my hope that today's webinar will help us start to do just that. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Xinshen Diao. Dr. Xinshen will present the impact of COVID-19 on the economy based on a social accounting matrix multiplier approach. She is currently the Deputy Division Director and a Senior Research Fellow in the Development, Strategy, and Governance Division of IFPRI and a sub-theme leader for the Policy, Institution, and Market Research Program. She has extensive experience doing research on economic development and growth, intersectoral linkages, regional integration dynamics, agriculture policies, and institutional changes. She has published more than 100 articles in various peer-reviewed economic journals, IFPRI books and monographs, and external book chapters. Dr. Xinshen earned a bachelor's and master's in business economics from the Beijing Institute of Economics and a PhD in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. We understand that there's going to be questions along the way, and given the many participants, we kindly ask that you write your questions. There's a bar on the right-hand side of your screen, so please write your questions during the presentation as they come up. The presentation will last for about 45 minutes. After that time, we'll have a question and answer. I'll call out questions and have speakers answer the questions, and we'll get through as many as possible. So with that said, let's get right to it. I'd like to invite Dr. Xinshen to please begin the presentation.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everybody. Like Matt said, this presentation actually is based on two recent studies funded by USAID under our joint program with MSU, MAPSA project. So my presentation will cover both studies. The first study is focused on COVID-19's impact on the whole economy. The analysis will be at the economy-wide level and the sector level. The second study actually is at the household level, focusing on the foreign remittance impact on poverty. Next slide. And so my presentation will be organized into 7 sections. I will give a preview of the results first, and then I will go through the methodology part as simple as possible in 2 slices. And then I will turn to the first study. The first study will be covered under section 3, which is for the short-term impact during lockdown period. And then section 4 is for the economic impact throughout 2020 for the whole year. And then I will turn to the second study, which is at the household level and on the impact of falling remittance on income and household income and poverty. And for this study, we also estimated financial support needed for affected remittance receiving per household. Finally, I will give policy remarks next. So we know, like Mike said, Myanmar's economy is actually heavily affected by the necessary lockdown measures. So the lockdown is very important necessary measure for controlling the outbreak of COVID virus spread. But on another side, it imposes heavy economic cost. So during the 2-week lockdown period, we estimate Myanmar's GDP is to be about 21% lower than without a lockdown for the similar period. So the agriculture food system is also negatively affected, even though agriculture is exempt from lockdown measures. The impact from agriculture food system coming mainly from falling consumers demand and export demand. We also estimate the lost job during the lockdown period is about 5.3 million people temporarily lose their job in these 2 weeks. So rural household income also show significant short-term decline, especially among rural non-farm households. Their income is expected to fall about 46%, and rural farm income will fall by 38%. Next slide. So the economy losses will be likely to persist throughout this year, even though the economy has been gradually reopened and some restrictions are eased, but there are still difficulty and still some restrictions remain. So we estimate the total economic loss in this year following Myanmar's GDP measure, which is for fiscal year 2020, starting last year, October to December is the first quarter, and of September this year at the last quarter, quarter 4. So the total economic loss in this fiscal year are estimated at between 6.4 trillion and 9 trillion CHF, compared with the projected normal growth under different growth recovering scenario. So with a slow recovery, we expect the economy will get into recession with a negative growth, but fast recovering at best may result in a stagnant growth. So agriculture growth is also negatively affected. Even under fast recurring scenario, we do not expect agriculture growth to become positive. It's still in the negative situation. Next slide. So at the household level, we assess the poverty impact from falling remittances. The poverty rate is expected to rise by 7.5 percentage points among remittance receiving households. Most of these more deeply poor or newly poor households are in rural areas. They are about 90% of total poor and new poor households. There are 700,000 such rural households, and 3.5 million people are their family members. So we also assess required annual financial support to these affected remittance received per households. The estimated financial support is about 230 billion CHF or $130 million US. Next slide. So now we turn to section 2. How do we measure the economic and poverty impact? Next. So the economic impact is measured using economy-wide multiplier model. So the model basically considers both direct and indirect impact of different lockdown policies and external shocks. The direct impact is relatively easy to understand, since during lockdown period, a lot of economic activities, manufacturing factories were closed, and travel and people's movement have been restricted. However, this direct affect the sector also generate indirect impact on other sectors, even those sectors are exempt from lockdown policy. Such indirect impact actually are involved in the whole supply chains, so such as input suppliers or downstream users. So that means the model need to know this kind of linkage between sectors. So therefore, the multiplier model actually use social accounting metric. In the social accounting metric, there's a detailed input-output relationship among sectors. Totally, we have a 63 such a economic sector in the model. Also, the sum include quite detailed household groups. We have 15 household groups. So in this way, we can use social accounting metric sum multiplier to assess joint impact through direct channels on the GDP, jobs, and household income. Next. So the model itself is quite a complicated mathematics model, but we can think about in a simple framework like this picture. There are two types of impact channels that will create direct impact in the model. On your left-hand side is the domestic impact channel. The domestic impact channels are those policies imposed during the lockdown period by the country itself. They are mainly at the different sector level, such as mining, manufacturing, construction, and so on. On the other side, actually the economy has been affected by other countries' lockdown policy. We call this global impact channel. So we only capture two such a channel, through export demand and through remittance. When the model is shocked through this domestic channel and the international channel, they created direct impact first. The direct impact will affect other sectors indirectly, created many rounds of indirect impact. By the end, the model will generate results at the sector level and for the economy as a whole, and also we can use it to measure loss in jobs and incomes. Next. So since the model is a simulation model, we need to design a scenario to introduce shock into the model. We basically consider two types of scenario. The first type of scenario, we focus on lockdown period, the 2 weeks in April. And then we also use the model to simulate the possible impact for the entire fiscal year 2020. So 2020 can be seen into 5 different phases. So the last 3 months in the first 3 months in 2019 and January this year, we can call it a COVID-free period. So in February and March, the impact actually mainly through external channel. Is mainly due to China's lockdown that affect our export. And then in April, the 2 weeks lockdown start to kick in. That's a severe impact period. After that, the remaining period of Q3, we are going to model certain ease in restriction, and then in the final quarter, we are going to have further ease in restriction. However, even by the end of this fiscal year, the economy is not assumed to completely recover to the normal situation. Next. So let's first look at impact during lockdown period. Next. So we already mentioned this economy-wide drop in GDP by 41% in the previous slides. So these slides are further include aggregate sector for agriculture, industry, and services. For industry, we also include manufacture and construction. But keep in mind, the model itself doesn't shock actually total GDP or sector GDP directly. The shock actually are introduced to the detailed sector in the model. For agriculture, we have 24 agriculture subsectors. For manufacture, we have 22. Services, we have 11. So all individual sectors can be directly affected by lockdown policy. Of course, some sectors are exempt from the shock. So the result we present here actually is the aggregate from detailed sector level. So we see in this slide, actually the only standalone sector as an individual sector in the sum is construction sector. Construction sector fall most in this slide. Actually, in services, there are some sector has a similar shock, like a hotel or restaurant. Next. So we need to understand how different impact channel actually affect the loss of GDP during lockdown period. These slides actually help us understand the contribution of different lockdown restrictions and different external shock to the loss in total GDP. We rank it according to the highest impact to lowest impact. The total loss in GDP is 100. So we see closing most of manufacturing factories actually contribute almost more than 1/3 of loss in GDP during lockdown period. And this different channels doesn't mean the impact actually come directly from shutdown manufacture. Due to the shutdown of manufacture, it created direct impact to manufacture itself, but also created indirect impact. This 34% contribution actually cover both direct and indirect impact from closing manufacturing factory. So these first two channels, closing manufacturing factories and closing non-essential business services, pretty much capture half of GDP loss. We can see actually I highlight foreign remittance. It contributes 7.3% economy-wide loss. Later, we are going to see this impact at household level. Next slide. So we also measure the impact for the agriculture food system. Agriculture food system include agriculture, also include downstream agri processing, food trade and transportation, and food services. So the total loss in ag food system is about 630 billion CHF, which is about 24% of total ag food GDP during this period. So we see actually some sector, actually some component of ag food system are badly hurt. For example, food services is most negatively affected by close of hotel, restaurant, and bars. However, its contribution to total loss in ag food system is very small because it counts only 1.1% of ag food system GDP. So about 1/4 of loss is from agriculture. Agriculture loss is mainly from indirect impact. So we don't have any direct shock to agriculture sector. Through the linkage with agro processing and food trade and transport, actually primary agriculture sector is negative effect by 14%. Next. Again, we also decompose different channels, the contribution to the loss in ag food GDP. And clothing manufacture still rank on the #1, even has much larger impact than the impact on total GDP. Almost 48% of loss in ag food GDP actually due to let's close down of manufacturing factory. But we notice two external channels reduce export demand, falling foreign remittance actually jump to #2, #3. That's different from economy-wide impact for total GDP. So these three channels together pretty much explain more than 80% loss in ag food system. Next slide. So we also measure the loss in jobs. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, the total loss in job is 5.3 million temporarily lost during these 2 weeks. They also include self-employed non-farm business. So some people, they may not really lose their income, for example, for some public sector and for some large firms. But since the economy, since their sector actually was negative affected, so that's why they don't contribute to GDP. So we counted as a loss in jobs. So about half, 50% of people during this period, actually they don't contribute to GDP, and then they lost their job. And then between industry and services, most of jobs actually lost in services. Next slide. So we also look at economy impact for the whole year 2020 next. So the economy has reopened. How to project the post-lockdown period is a big challenge, since there are a lot of uncertainties, not only from domestic part, but also from a global environment. Therefore, we designed 2 scenarios to see the different recovery, what kind of impact for this year. Under fast recurring scenario, basically economy is assumed to rebound back relatively quickly and also much stronger in the last quarter of this year. And then under slow recurring scenario, the rebound pace is much slower. So the table basically summarizes some major assumptions under 2 different scenarios. And until May, they are all the same. The difference actually kick in June in this month. So, and then the significant difference actually is in Q4. And for the global shock, the difference actually coming in Q4. We assume exports start to recover, but still only about 75% the normal situation under fast recovery and 50% under slow recovery. Remittance actually was recovered much slowly. Only under fast recovery scenario, we assume remittance income will come back about 50%. Next slide. So how to measure the whole year's impact? So we are thinking about to present in a way, the first we present as accumulated changes. So means the total economic loss is measured against a normal growth. So the black line in this chart actually represent projected normal growth from 2019. the gain from 2019 GDP. Without COVID shock, we expect by the end of fiscal year, the national GDP will be about 7 trillion more than 2019. The growth rate of 6.4% actually was predicted in last year, December, by World Bank. Following this growth rate, so GDP will be 7 trillion more by the end of fiscal year. With COVID shock, the curve start to departure in March. The first slow departure, but still positive growth, actually is caused by the falling in export. It's shock mainly from China side. However, the red curve and the yellow curve turn to negative down slope curve. So that is mainly due to lockdown and post-lockdown slow ease situation. The different ease scenario actually start in June. We see the red and the yellow curve start to departure. So under fast recovering scenario, the red curve, so the economies stop falling, but they didn't gain a lot. Under slow recovery scenario, the yellow curve, so economy continue to fall. So the loss is measured by the end of these three curves. So compare with the end of black curve, that's the end of this year, fiscal year. The gap between red and black curve actually is measured at 6.4 trillion. And between black and yellow curve is measured at 9 trillion. That's accumulated losses for the GDP in fiscal year 2020 under two different recurring scenarios. Next. We also can measure the economic situation by growth rate in different quarters and also annual growth rate. So this chart basically report 4 different quarters growth rate compared with 2019 and also annual growth rate. So of course, the first quarter is a COVID-free quarter, so we have a normal growth rate 6.4, and then the second quarter is mainly affected by export shock, which affect the growth rate but still positive. And then the third quarter is the main quarter that caused a huge economy drop. And the economy recover start in end of third quarter, mainly in the last quarter. So with fast recovery, we see actually the economy become positive in growth rate in last quarter, but under slow recovery, the growth rate is negative. Putting all this impact together, we expect the economy will be under recession with slow recovering scenario, means a negative 2.2% growth. Under fast recovering scenario, we are thinking about vast strong rebound in the last quarter of this year, but annual growth rate is still very, very modest. So we should call it stagnant growth under fast growth scenario. Next. So we also measured a similar kind of growth for agriculture. So agriculture sector, you can see during the lockdown period and in the entire third quarter is relatively less negative affected with a negative growth rate 8 or 7% under two different scenarios. Because there's no enough room to recover, that's why the recovery itself also didn't gain too much. So putting all this together, agriculture growth will be negative in 2020, even with fast recovery. Next. So IFPRI system is in between in this the estimation for total GDP and agriculture GDP. So IFPRI system under the best case scenario and the fast recovery scenario will have zero growth, but with slow recovery, the growth rate will be negative minus 1.7%. We see actually the early impact from export shock already push IFPRI system growth rate to very, very low level. And then in Q3, the negative impact is very significant. Next slide. So the employment impact for this whole year, actually, we measured in 3 different periods. So we start from third quarter April, and then third quarter May and June, and the last quarter. So in my preview slide, remember the total loss in job is 5.3 million during 2 weeks lockdown. By the end of April, some of lost job already recovered. So by the end of April, the lost job is 3.4 million. So with the economy recover, more and more people start to return to their non-farm jobs. So under fast recovery scenario, it will allow additional 1.5 million people returning to their non-farm jobs. So that basically is measured by these two, the length of the 2 bars. So under slow recovery, there will be 1.6 million job loss, and the fast recovery, there's 500 loss. So it means even there, most of people will actually return to their jobs, but still not everybody can come back to their jobs. There are about 500,000 people, they are going to lose job even by the end of this year. Next. Next. Yes, and then we also measured income impact for the whole year, similar as the employment of impact. So we consider April, May, and June. These 3 months are Q3 and Q4 and annual impact. So as expected, impact on rural non-farm actually is relatively larger than impact on rural farm income. That's understandable since most of lockdown policy actually directly target non-farm businesses. So the recovery actually is relatively faster under fast recovery scenario for rural non-farm income. So in Q4 under fast recovery scenario, basically the rural farm and rural non-farm income, the loss will be converted. They are in the negative area, but the difference become very small. By the end of this year, we expect both rural farm and rural non-farm income will be lower than without the COVID situation. Next slide. So now we turn to the next study, which is at the household level to measure the income and poverty impact from foreign remittance. This study is done by a micro simulation model. It's not by the economy-wide model. So micro simulation model is built on the household survey data. Since the 2017 survey data is not available, we use Myanmar Poverty and Living Conditions Survey 2015 data to build this model. So the model includes all detailed income expenditure information for all individual households covered by the survey. So there are about 24% household with remittance income in the survey. So since we don't have enough information to identify individual households specifically for what kind of household they lose their remittance income, their migrant family member have returned to the country. We shock all remittance income uniformly for all households. So we shock international remittance income by 50%, assume international remittance income fall about 50%. Domestic remittance income fall by 30%. And then the expenditure actually is the measure for the poverty. We assume the expenditure at the household level will be affected proportionally to the falling in their remittance income. After the shock, we calculated the new poverty result. So we focus on low income and poor household only. So low income in our definition is those households belong to second expenditure quintile, but they are not poor in the initial data. So based on their new expenditure after shock, we can assess how many people, how many households now they fall into poverty. Next. So even though the shock is uniformly for all remittance received households, we see quite heterogeneity impact of falling remittance on different households. The reason is the remittance income for different households actually play different roles. So this graph basically shows the cumulative distribution of impact of falling remittance on total household income. There are two dashed lines. So the top dashed line actually pass through the blue line at the point minus 15%. That means about 40% rural household, rural low-income household actually will rural low and poor and low-income household will experience decline in their income at least by 15%. The lower dashed line actually cuts through the blue dot at minus 30%. That means about 20% rural low and poor and low income household will lose their total income by 30 to 50% from the remittance shock. Next. So we also group all of the households into different types. In addition to total household, we call national average, and rural, total rural and urban. Within total rural, we further group them by farm, non-farm household, as smallholders, landless, and rural female household. So for each type of household, we also consider poor household and low-income household. From this graph, we can see low-income households are actually constantly affected, negatively affected more than poor household. So only for non-farm household, landless household, and urban household, and low-income and poor household are similar affected. So we see actually the most affected households are rural female households, especially rural female low-income households. Next. Since low-income household actually has been affected more by their income, we actually further look at what kind of poverty impact among them. The alarming number of low-income remittance households actually will be possible to fall into poverty. In total, 65% of low-income remittance rural households are expected to fall into poverty after the shock. So this chart actually also gave us different type of household for the percentage of low-income household to fall into poverty. We see actually for female head low-income rural household with remittance, 80% of them will become poor. for smallholders, 73% of them will become poor. All of these households that we are talking about is a remittance receiving household. Next. Because of falling in income and also rising in poverty among low-income households, so we calculated the poverty rate among all remittance receiving households. So we expect poverty rate rise by 7.5 percentage points among all remittance receiving households after the shock. There are about 600,000 poor remittance households. Even before the shock, they are poor households. This kind of household will become much more impoverished. At the top of these 600,000 households, there are another 200,000 households. They are not poor, they are low income before, but now they become poor household after shock. Totally, there are about 4 million people live in this more impoverished and newly impoverished households. And then the graph gave us the poverty rate before and after shock for different type of household group. Next. Also, we notice most of newly poor remittance households are in rural areas. Taking newly poor low-income household for the whole country at 187.4% of them actually in rural area, and then 58.3% actually are farm household, and smallholder is about 37%. So all of the rural poor household, even before the shock, there are about 530,000 poor rural remittance receiving households. And of course, all of these households will become further poorer. So in addition to those origin of in the poverty poor household, there are 170,000 previous low-income rural households that will fall into poverty after the shock. Moreover, among them, 250,000 households have young children under 5 years old. We can expect there will be very significant negative nutrition and health impact on their young children. Next. So we estimate the financial support required for affect the remittance receiving per household in next slide. So we did it in two different ways to estimate possible financial needed. For those already poor household, we assign the required financial support according to their falling income in remittance. In total, it is about 144 billion CAD or 95 million US dollar. For the previous low income but not poor remittance receiving household, we calculate their current income after shock and the poverty gap. So it means the composition is not their total lost income, it's only income that can bring them out of the poverty. In total, it needs 89 billion CAD or 59 million US dollar for preventing them from falling into poverty. Putting the two group of households together, the estimated total financial support required for affect poor and new poor remittance receiving household is about 230 billion CAD or 150 million dollar. Next. Next. So I conclude with 4 policy remarks. Of course, there are many policy issues we can further discuss. The first things we notice reopening manufacturing sector is quite important for Myanmar's broad economy and also agri-food system recovery. The reason is not only because manufacturing is a large sector, which account about 20% of GDP, but also because manufacturing has the strongest linkage effect with both upstream primary agriculture and downstream transportation, trade, and other services. Without almost return to normal manufacture, it's hard to imagine the economy can actually return to its recent high growth trajectory. So we also emphasize the continued policy support to the agri-food system. We know agriculture is excluded from the lockdown policy. This allows the agriculture, not only agriculture, but also the whole economy. Negative impact is much smaller. The continued such support to the recovery of the economy as well as the whole agriculture food system is crucial. So we also emphasize expanding the coverage of social protection program. The importance of this for those people actually affected by COVID and then falling into poverty is very important. Here we emphasize the remittance income because the falling in remittance income is likely to be prolonged for a year or more. However, we also need to identify other most vulnerable and affected households. So we know the country has released comprehensive and sensible economic relief plan. That according to other people's estimation, the total package is about 2.8 trillion. Compared with the economy lost, we measured in the model, which is about 6.4 to 9 trillion. The package seemed to be relatively modest. The size of economic stimulus package may need to be much bigger in order for the economy to be able to return to its growth trajectory in next year. Next. So we also have an appendix that document the detailed economic impact during lockdown period, which is the base for us to do the simulation to design our shock. Due to the time constraint, I will keep it out of my presentation, but they are in the slides, at the end of this slides. So we also have a working paper for the economy-wide impact analysis and the 2 policy notes, one for economy-wide impact analysis, one for remittance impact analysis. So this slide also gave us the link for different paper and policy notes. Also, we have a different policy notes we didn't cover today. So for COVID analysis, you can find it from IFPRI Myanmar website. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shinshin. That was a lot of, very sobering information. And I'm sure there are many questions and people asking, so what do we do now? To help answer some of those questions, along with Dr. Shinshin, we also have Dr. Duncan Boughton. Many of you know Duncan. He's lived in Myanmar for the last 4 years. He's a professor at Michigan State University and the chief of party for the Myanmar Agriculture Policy Support Activity, and works closely with the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Irrigation's Department of Planning, and teaches a course at Yezin Agriculture University. Again, if you'll notice, there's a sidebar on your screen. There's a tab that says questions. You can type in questions. We already have a couple of questions in there, and we'll start to go through them. But please add more questions. We're happy to answer them. The first question is from Mike Ackister from World Fish, and this is for Dr. Shinshin. He says, when you refer to the difficulty in fishery production, does this include both aquaculture and capture fisheries, inland and marine? Thank you. So Dr. Shinshin?
Yes, yeah. So unfortunately, in our SAM, we couldn't separate these two types of fish sector. We combine them together. So, but we expect the main impact actually from aquaculture. Yeah.
All right. And then we have another question from Anna Belov saying, and this is about the SAM modeling, is the current modeling reflecting possible second wave impact?
I try to understand when the question asks a second wave. So what we modeled actually is the lockdown impact and the ease of lockdown restriction. However, the model itself created many waves of impact. So the direct impact itself is only those sectors directly shut down or restricted in activities. The SAM multiply basically captured the indirect impact. In most cases, the indirect impact even much bigger than direct impact. So if your question is, you call this as the second wave, I should say we have a multiple wave. It's because it's circulate impact in the SAM.
Okay, thank you. And Anna, if you need more clarification, please write back and we can answer that. Thank you, Shinshin. Here's another question for Shinshin from Leo from Mercy Corps. Says, you already pointed out that the impacts felt are different depending on target groups. Are the differences between regions and states, are there differences? And do you have that data? And if so, could that be shared? And Dr. Shinshin, also Duncan, if you also want to add on to that, please.
For the SAM multiplier analysis, unfortunately, we don't have a regional level data. So it's a national SAM, plus the shock at this level usually pretty much affect everywhere in the country. For remittance analysis, unfortunately, we couldn't get access to 2017 survey. 2017 survey actually is represented at the state and regional level, which allow us to analyze regional state level impact. 2015 survey only represent at the zonal level. We did look at two zones. They rely on international remittance. Indeed, this remittance receiving household in these two zones, they are more affected than other zones.
Duncan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think one thing we do know, obviously, is that the remittance loss will hit most severely where the migrants are most populous. Right? And there is data from the same data set about the distribution of migrants nationally. So we do know, for example, Chin State or Rakhine or Tanintari or the southeast part of Myanmar, we know where the most of the migrants are coming from, and so in that sense, we do know geographically where those households are most frequent and where they're most likely to be hit. But the scale of this impact on the rural areas is actually very broad. If you look at the analysis that Shinshin presented, it's a wide variety of rural households that are being affected. So this is a very, very broad and widespread and deep situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, and next we have a question from Agnes Luz. and I think I gave this to Duncan. What are the factors that will determine fast or slow recovery?
That's a really excellent question, Agnes. I really appreciate that question. I think some of them have been highlighted already in Xinshen's recommendations. Namely, right now we're going into the monsoon season, the most important agricultural season of the year. Farmers are trying to get their crops planted, they're trying to get access to inputs. Even as we speak, a lot of households are having difficulty accessing those inputs and services, especially they're having difficulties with financial access to those services and inputs because their incomes have fallen. So the more that can be done to ensure access of households to the resources they need to be successful during the monsoon season, then the faster the recovery will be. And this, of course, means ensuring that there is good access for the distributors of inputs to keep the supplies going to the retailers in the rural areas, ensuring that farmers, especially farmers with perishable crops, have timely and cost-effective market access. It's so critical for the perishable crops because, of course, if there's delays in getting them to market, then it's a total loss. So certainly in the near term, keeping input markets functioning effectively, getting output markets functioning effectively, allowing the movement of goods, what they refer to in China as green pathways for inputs and outputs, as well as trying to expand the financial capabilities of rural households to conduct their growing season. Now, of course, I'm focusing right now on the period right now with the beginning of the monsoon, but of course, once we get into the harvesting, and of course that even affects right now the harvest of the post-monsoon paddy crop, traders also need to be able to access the raw material, they need finance, they need to be able to process and move their products. So keeping the economy moving downstream from the farm is also important. So to the extent that it can be kept open, to the extent it can be financially solvent, then the recovery will be faster. And I'm sure, Agnes, that you also have a lot of good ideas about how to support those processes. Thank you.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Peter Schmidt, and it's also I'll also tag on Situ Wei's question because they're very similar. The first question says, thanks for the presentations. My question is on the remittance-related presentation. You assumed a reduction in international remittances by 50%, those of domestic remittances by 30%. On what did you base this? And then adding on to that, did the analysis include the economic impact on immigrant workers working abroad that came back to Myanmar during the COVID crisis? Dr. Xinshen?
Yes, actually, we try to get as much as possible information about remittance returning of migrant too, but it's hard to really pin down to the number. So the rough number we see from news medium and then other people's assessment is about I think it's about 1 million people they returned back. So that's why the shock itself is possible even smaller than the actual situation. So for the domestic remittance, we basically consider the impact on textile industry. Is a big sector with lots of rural remittance, and also shut down construction or many other activities that have to force domestic remittance to return to their home country. So means definitely that we don't, at this moment, we don't have enough information. And IFPRI office now with MSU is doing some remittance household phone survey. We hope after this phone survey, we can have much better information. We can revisit our model to maybe adjust our shock.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next question is also for you, and this is from Jonathan. He says, in the macro level modeling at the start of the presentation, it was highlighted that non-farm households would be impacted more than farm households. However, later in the presentation, the impact from the fall of remittances is modeled as affecting the farming households and smallholders more than the non-farm rural households. Could you explain the seemingly contradictory finding?
So actually, remittance shock is only one of the shock in the economy-wide model. So the household level analysis so far, we only focus on remittance income. We are in the process actually to develop the second household analysis to consider both remittance income effect and a lockdown impact. So we expect maybe after we have a lockdown impact that may affect actually non-farm household much bigger. So that study is still ongoing now.
Okay, thank you. And Duncan, here's a question from Henry, and you've done a lot of work on surveys here in Myanmar on remittances. And just to clarify, in the definition of remittances, did you include only funds coming from outside of Myanmar, or also urban-rural remittances inside of Myanmar?
I think this covered both. That's why we call domestic remittance and our international remittance.
Okay. And Duncan, do you want to just, say anything about that, or just agree?
I agree.
All right, here's one for you from Mike Exeter again. Duncan, why don't you start, and then if Dr. Shinshen, if you want to add, you can. Do you think the process of land use reform will now accelerate due to the need to make better use per unit area of land? Example, integrated aquaculture, rice, fish, veg production on what was exclusively rice land. I don't know why, Mike, you'd be asking that question, but go ahead, Duncan.
That's a great question, Michael. I think the issue of land is important to the long run recovery process. If we think about this is really the depth of this crisis, to be honest with you, is shocking. I think it shows that the gains that have been made in recent years are actually quite fragile because they are so dependent on the remittances. So as we think about long-term agricultural and rural economic development strategy, and we think about the phrase of build back better, your question is extremely pertinent. Right? How can we use land in ways that make the agriculture and the rural sector more economically resilient? And that means obviously more climate resilient, but also resilient to these kind of economic shocks that come from outside, like we've just seen. And certainly systems that increase the value of production per unit of land and per unit of labor are certainly a huge part of that. And of course, the systems that you're promoting with support from USAID also have very important nutritional spillovers by increasing the availability of and reducing the cost of a highly nutritious diet. But we also need to think about the role of land in relation to financial access to farmers. It's really clear from this crisis that we really have to broaden and deepen financial inclusion. Every household needs to have access to financial services and a broader range of financial services. And land documentation is a critical part of that broader financial inclusion. And for example, in the case of the systems that you're developing, smallholder farmers who move into these more intensive aquaculture rice systems, they're going to need new insurance products as well as larger operating capital streams. So the land dimension is important both for financial inclusion as well as for the intensification of systems. But I really think that you put your finger on a very important area for the long-term development strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. The next question for Dr. Shinshin. This comes from Paul, who says, you mentioned that manufacturing was heavily affected, but the impact in urban areas is much less. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, actually, for the economy-wide analysis, we didn't present urban household income. Urban household income actually also fall a lot. So remittance analysis, we focus only on poor and low-income households. So actually, remittance income also fall among less poor households. Those households mainly actually in urban areas. So we didn't present that part, since we feel that those households definitely we feel sorry for them. They lost income, but they may have some cushion, a kind of coping strategy from their saving and from their assets. Therefore, we do not really include in the analysis, even though they are in the data.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question is for Duncan. This is from Ong Tun U. It says, thanks for the presentation. The model has limitations that it totally relies on available data, i.e. secondary data. So how likely is it that the government, how likely is it the government should rely on this modeling outcome and policy options, as well as invest in a sector-wide recovery based on secondary data? Duncan?
That's a really excellent question, Ong Tun U. And I know Ong Tun U well, and I'm really impressed with his perception. I think that you can think about this analytical process in three phases. The first is the kind of analysis that Shinshen and her colleagues have done on the basis of secondary data that enable the government and development partners and civil society to anticipate what the expected impacts might be. Now, you can't know with certainty, but you can know, based on the secondary data, who is most vulnerable to what kinds of shocks. And that enables the government and development partners to prepare. And in fact, the government did, in its comprehensive economic recovery program, include specific activities to address the kind of threats that Shinshen and her colleagues have mentioned based on this analysis of secondary data. Now, of course, Ong Tun U, you're right, that's not enough. You then have to, and Shinshen alluded to this just a moment ago, you then have to verify in real time, are we actually seeing the kinds of impacts that these models predicted? Are they more severe? Are they less severe? Are the kind of groups that we thought would be impacted affected, or are there others that we didn't anticipate? Relating to an earlier question, are there certain geographical areas that are sensing this more profoundly than others? And so there are several organizations, even as we speak, like World Food Program, FAO, and the IFPRI-led MAPSA program, both with support from USAID and also from the Livelihoods and Food Security Fund. They are funding phone surveys with different stakeholders throughout the agricultural and food system. It's from input retailers, mechanization service suppliers, farmers, landless households, traders. So in real time, every week, information is being collected to see whether the kind of impacts that were anticipated through Shinshen's modeling are actually occurring in practice, and how do we need to adapt our strategies based on real-time current data. And that won't be the final step. A few months from now, there'll need to be a more comprehensive and in-depth assessment to see to what extent are these shocks temporary, or to what extent have households lost assets, lost their ability to recover, and will require even more sustained help. So there's a series of phases in this, and we are transitioning from the predictive phase using secondary data to the kind of actual impact on the ground using real-time data. But thank you for that excellent question.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have from Biplov. This is for Dr. Shinshin. Thanks for this rich and insightful paper. It would be useful to know how the overall GDP impacts mentioned in the paper compare with those of IMF and World Bank tentative estimates. If so, can you explain any variation or variance?
So what we see so far, IMF World Bank projection actually was down even before the country's lockdown. So most of analysis from the international organization actually is a little bit delayed since they have done this globally. So their projection actually is more optimistic. I believe World Bank IMF projection for the country's impact is relatively modest. And then I think most of international organizations now actually start to adjust their projection, especially when the pandemic hit developed world badly now. So we have done this similar analysis for many countries. Of course, for most of the countries, they are similar. As Myanmar, they haven't even had any statistic to show what has happened. The only country we have done that has statistics released is China. So China actually already released their real statistics for first quarter, since China was affected by COVID much early. So we compare with our analysis and the release statistics. We feel the lockdown impact so far we consider, if the lockdown actually is real lockdown, almost complete shutdown most of the economic activity, what we estimate the GDP impact actually is smaller. So in the case of China, so they even have a Hubei province. We know Wuhan becomes so popular now. Wuhan is the capital city of Hubei province. So they have a provincial levels GDP as well as national GDP for first quarter, also until April. So for the provincial level, so since Hubei is a complete lockdown, and then GDP fall even more than what we estimate for Myanmar, the 2 weeks. So that's why at this moment, I think our analysis, we couldn't really find a similar comparison in terms of the period they covered. They start analysis much earlier than what we start. Yeah. You mute yourself.
I knew that was going to happen eventually. Thank you. So a couple questions on the targeting side. Thank you. This one's from Travis for Duncan. It says, looking ahead, what domestic opportunities should the government, communities, development actors focus on to help with the recovery? More specifically, what sectors, ag, manufacturing, tourism, should be prioritized in stimulus efforts to help rural and urban recovery?
Well, Travis, thank you very much for that question. You know, I'm very glad that you weren't on my doctoral thesis committee, because that's a really challenging question. And I'm going to need Shinshin's help, because I can speak a little bit to the agricultural and rural sector, but Shinshin has a much better understanding about the overall economy and the relationship between agriculture and non-agricultural sectors, and how the non-agricultural agricultural sectors feed into each other. So I'm going to let Xinshen address that part of the question about different sectors and ensuring that you know, the overall economy is functioning well. In terms of the agricultural and the rural economy, I think we have different phases to consider. In the very short run, these shocks are extremely significant. We're talking about a large number of poor people who are now in even deeper poverty. We're talking about a large number of people who weren't able to afford a nutritious diet before, even less able to afford a nutritious diet. So there really is the possibility of significant lasting harm because of malnutrition. And so this is why this group of households that Xinshen has identified, and we're very fortunate to have a IFPRI nutrition economist, Derek Heddy, in country to help with this issue, is that these families with under fives, women-headed households, pregnant women in households that have lost income urgently need to be targeted with assistance to maintain an adequate level of nutrition. And of course, they're not the only vulnerable group, but as a kind of a particular example of this urgent short-term need. And then we can think about this medium-term need of ensuring that farming households can be successful during the monsoon season, successful in their production, successful in their marketing, moving into the post-monsoon season, so they can start to build up their income flows. And then in the longer term, addressing the underlying causes of this lack of resilience in agriculture and the rural economy. But I'm going to put a comma in there and ask Xinshen if she would talk a little bit about this balance between other agriculture and other sectors like tourism, manufacturing, and so on. Xinshen.
Yeah, so when we emphasize manufacture, so the reason is if you look at the recent growth in last 5, even longer period, so manufacture has played a very important role for explaining the rapid growth in Myanmar. So actually, manufacture before crisis, manufacture already start to become such a big sector, counting about 20% GDP. That's very, very successful in terms of industrialization. Few developing countries actually have reached that high level. In addition, a lot of new manufacturing sector are labor intensive. It's export-oriented, labor-intensive. Garment industry is a good example. That's why, so when we talk about what kind of sector the government should consider to put as a priority, we have to realize that the manufacturing sector that are heavily affected are those export-oriented manufacturers. The country may not come from the country itself, actually come from global condition. So when export-oriented economy, export-oriented manufacture is badly affected, we need to think about some alternatives. Like Duncan said, maybe those sectors, they are not that heavily depend on international conditions, and then the government can do more by our own policy to support it. We cannot depend on foreign tourists to come back and then the economy to recover. We need to think about alternatives. What kind of alternative actually can help the country recover by itself? That kind of activity mainly relate to the rural household and domestic services. They actually created demand internally and created linkage effect internally.
Okay, thank you. So we have about a little less than 10 minutes left for questions. We have quite a few questions left, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. This next question is from Eric. This is also for Dr. Xinshen. Thank you very much for the great presentation. Following up on Duncan's remark on the distribution of migrants with higher concentration in Chin, Rakhine, Southeast Myanmar, these are some of the areas most severely affected by other crises. Was the research able to include such multiplier effect into its conclusions regarding recovery?
It's a good question. Actually, for the recurring analysis, so far it's still very rough assessment. We couldn't really have any work done at the state and regional level. Like Duncan said, that needs to have some ground level information, real information. We hope the series phone survey actually can really provide such information, and we can further improve our modeling analysis.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have for Duncan, and this is from Paul, saying, do you expect, based on the analysis, an increase in rural to urban migration?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, Paul. If the measures that government and development partners and civil society are able to take is decisive, it's quick, it's at scale, then hopefully we would not see an acceleration of migration to urban areas. Right now, I don't think that would be helpful because there's already a lot of urban unemployment because of the shock. So to the extent that the rural economy can be supported by the kinds of things that we've been discussing, to the extent that people can make a living in those rural areas, including returned migrants who've come back with skills, then there shouldn't be a need for increased urban migration. Perhaps we could even think about not seeing an increase in urban migration as a sign that the economic recovery measures are successful. So I think we should do everything we can to try to avoid that scenario, at least until the economic recovery is complete. And then the natural process of outmigration from agriculture to other sectors resumes its normal trajectory. In other words, that would be fine as part of a normal, healthy development process, but not as a response to extreme deprivation. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. So here's a question for you, Dr. Shin from April. And this is kind of, I think it's a good question because it says, you know, people are innovative and they change their behaviors. So how was the model able to capture that in terms of the food sector? There are transactions happening directly during COVID while people are staying at home. They tend to order more food, groceries online. One example, some mango producers said their sales increased compared to last year thanks to direct order through Facebook. So was the model able to capture some of these new innovations that were spurred because of the lockdown?
Yeah, I don't think we can have such a detailed non-existing activity before and after shock. The new innovations start to actually compensate the shock. So, but generally speaking, we do not really shock to the level to close the economy. So that we pretty much leave the room for some economic activities still function either in a traditional way or in a new way. Like restaurant, even for restaurant, we do not completely shut down, since they still can carry out. And online shopping basically replace a lot of in-store shopping. So that I think that part we basically model in a way we don't really give the shock as it. So like for example, the lockdown policy asks you to completely close your business, but in the model we don't really completely close any sector's business.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Duncan. This is from Paul. And he says, what are some steps that would strengthen land documentation? This is a follow-up question, I think, to Mike's question about land.
So Paul is determined to find a question I can't answer, and I think he's succeeded. So yeah, I mean, this is a very specialist area, right? And we do have outstanding land specialists in Myanmar who could speak to this subject much more broadly than I can. We do know that the traditional forms of land documentation that are acceptable for the purposes of access to credit, like the Form 7, have not been allocated in a geographically inclusive way. In other words, there are many parts of the country that don't have acceptable land documentation for the purposes of securing credit. And of course, they're more vulnerable to loss of their land because they don't have secure documentation. And we see that very, very clearly in the data from our surveys. So there does need to be a systematic, publicly agreed, legislated process to have inclusive land documentation. It's essential. There can't be a sustainable development process without that. But we also know that it's very complex because of the history and because of the competing land claims, because of the difficult history we've seen. So it's one thing to say it's essential that there has to be inclusive land use documentation or land right documentation that is a basis for getting credit. And that means in some ways a much stronger and more vigorous effort at land administration. But we also know that it's not going to be a simple process to move forward and resolve that. But it's an excellent question.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left here. So I'll have one more question. And this is for Duncan. It says, how can you make, this is from Kiran saying, how to make location-specific appropriate interventions in micro-eco situation, particularly in vulnerable areas, is a challenging risk. And I guess, so maybe recommendations that you have quickly. And then there's been some questions about how to access the presentation. And again, the presentation can be found on the IFPRI Myanmar website. So Duncan.
So the question related, and just help me to understand it clearly, Matt, the question was related to interventions for specific micro ecosystems. So that implied to me that somehow we were talking about agricultural technologies, whether it's crop technologies or integrated farming technologies, or was there some other aspect to the question?
I think it may just be more targeting at the very micro level. It's easy to talk broadly across, rural environments, but more at the micro level. What are some ways quickly that we can do that?
Quickly, Matt, he said. Quickly, he said. So I think it really depends whether we're talking about targeting from the perspective of emergency response, right? So quickly identifying households that have under fives that are in distress, female headed households that are in distress. So quickly identifying who is in a very difficult situation, that requires obviously local administration. In terms of the longer term development pathways, that is a more complex process. It requires a lot of mapping about agroecological possibilities. And there is an initiative underway, I think with DFID, engaging the whole of CGIAR to try to develop this kind of more mapping of what kind of microecosystem interventions are possible for sustained growth. And I hope that was quick enough, Matt.
That was quick enough that you get another question. This is from Irene from the INGO forum. So it just says, thank you for the insightful research. Have you shared this research with the government? And if so, what has been their reaction? We have the CERP and other initiatives from Lion Ministries. It's good to know if they are factoring in these findings as they're being provided.
That was a question for you, Matt, wasn't it?
You're the panelist. I'm just the moderator.
I mean, that's a really excellent question. I think we really have to credit the Myanmar government with being very, very responsive. Right? They very, very quickly organized themselves at the most senior level, initially in terms of a health response, then in terms of an economic recovery response. And my experience is that these committees have been very, very open, attentive, and responsive to empirical advice. I think they've done a really excellent job. And the two main constraints that I think the government is facing is one, extremely limited financial space. The amount of money that's available to the Myanmar government to address this problem is very, very limited. And so inevitably, I mean, the scale of the problem is really huge. And so inevitably, the government is struggling to think about the best way to allocate these very limited resources. And there really isn't like the perfect answer, but I think they've been extremely responsive. The other is that the volume of information that is becoming available is increasing every day. And so we need to think about, I'm talking about myself and Shinshan and others who are gathering now vast quantities of information. How do we make this accessible to the government in a digestible way? So we're not just throwing data at them but giving them informed analytical insights that help decision making. But in terms of the general question that you are asking, I think the government's been very responsive to the information and analysis that's being made available to them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Shinshin. Thank you, Duncan. Great questions, everybody. We, of course, would like to get through more of them, but a limited amount of time. Please reach out to both Duncan and Shinshin if you do have more questions. I'm sure they'd be happy to respond. On behalf of the donors of the Agriculture and Rural Development Sector Coordination Group, I'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Shinshin, once again for sharing the important analysis. It's clear how these necessary policy actions meant to contain the spread of COVID-19 resulted in dramatic disruptions in the economy. And for those of us engaged in agriculture and rural development, we see the impact was not initially as dramatic as it was for other sectors, but the recovery will likely take much longer. Firms, policymakers, development partners can look at this analysis, begin to prioritize recovery actions and target those most affected and vulnerable. In the CERP 4.1.2, I'm sure we all have different sections memorized. It identifies the unconditional cash and in-kind transfers to vulnerable and affected communities at the appropriate amount. All very true. But this analysis helped present and clearly shows that remittance-receiving rural households, and especially female-headed households, are particularly affected and should be targeted. And it gives the parameters for what is the appropriate level of support. Poverty in Myanmar has declined rapidly over the last decade, but this progress really is now threatened. We hope for a rapid recovery, but we also must be deliberate about building back better. This means more resilient and inclusive economy going forward, an agriculture sector that is resilient to climate shocks, as well as market and price shocks. And we hope this event is actually just part of a larger ongoing discussion among stakeholders, and that we can stay actively engaged with one another in this response. Again, we anticipate additional webinars as new information becomes available, and hope that we can continue this discussion then. But until then, we thank you for your participation and engagement, and we wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.